We can't go to Walgreens to get batteries for Grandma's hearing aid because it's the Sabbath. Well, that's rather manic. But on the other hand, if Sunday is just get ready for Monday day, that's a great loss too.
You actually have to just block out that day first of all. This day is untouchable. And so you tell the work of the week, you got 6 days. But here's the thing that happens. You start having to reassess what's a priority, what's important.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we may hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, the summer is winding down. People are thinking about sending the kids back to school. School is kind of a wild card these days. Masks, no masks, vaccine, not vaccine. Some folks are trying out homeschooling or microschooling, thinking about charter schooling. We want to talk about an attractive school choice for parents, and it has to do with classical academies. My expert guest has written about this recently. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. Brandon McCoy, welcome to the Catholic Current.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Brandon, oftentimes when things aren't working, and I think we can safely say, by and large, the public school system hasn't been working, and there's honestly problems with some parochial schools as well. Ordinarily, when something isn't working, people say, let's try something new. You seem to be suggesting, let's try something old. That's counterintuitive, but why are you making that suggestion?
I think when you look at the history of American public education or education more broadly, you see a pretty continuous way about how students have been educated from colonial times up until the early 1900s, and that's been in the traditional liberal arts manner. Once you get to that point, you have the rise of various movements that try to sort of move away from the more traditional aspects of education, become a lot more experimental. And I think that has sort of become some of the problems that we see today. And so I think that, yes, you're right that I'm advocating for something that's, quote, older. But what I also want to stress is that I think that classical education is adaptive to the modern times and can meet the modern needs of today as well.
Right. You know, I'm a big advocate of classical education, and I'm aware, too, that I don't want to suggest that, prior to 1970, everything was absolutely just fine, because that's not true. I think back to when Henry Ford wrote his autobiography in the 1920s, and he said the trouble with my workers is they have their two hands attached to a brain. And wouldn't it be great to have an education system that made people functional drones, where it took all their concentration just to go to the factory and turn the widget for 12 hours a day while standing? And John Dewey stepped forward and says, I think I can help you with that. And Aldous Huxley was so alarmed by what Henry Ford and John Dewey were doing that he wrote his cautionary tale called The Brave New World. What's the rough basic insight of classical education? Give us, if you will, a classical definition of classical education, and then talk about how it's being adapted for today.
I would say that the way you would see classical education today is basically a study of all things that are traditional, enduring, and authoritative. The reason I choose these words in particular is because the classical education is so focused on learning about the history of Western civilization, the history of the culture that you live in, and learning about humanity more broadly, is that you spend a lot of time reviewing the things of the past, whether it be the text of the past or the histories of people, public figures in the past, that really should guide how we think about the problems of today and how we should, form the values that we have in our lives, both within and outside of school as well. Just a brief overview of what a classical education has to offer.
Okay, and I understand that there's there's an element of character development as well. And I want to stress that for this reason. I think character is rooted in moral imagination. And John Sr., in his book, The Restoration of Christian Culture, warned against having a great books program in college as the panacea, that, the one thing that would solve everything. He said, if you haven't had your moral imagination developed by the time you're in high school, when you send someone to a great books program, you end up with well-read, skeptical dilettantes, and that's certainly not the way to go. What's the role of character education in a classical education?
Right, the character education is certainly, I would say, is one of the most important aspects of a classical education. Not only because I think it's necessary to develop a certain character to be attracted to this type of learning. I don't think that students, particularly younger students, can intuitively approach a certain set of facts with the same sort of rigor that we would expect of adults. I think they have to be trained to do so. It's not quite intuitive to a high schooler why they should have to read the Aeneid or why they should have to study ancient Latin or Greek when there's no people going about today speaking ancient Latin or Greek. And so the character training is important for those academic reasons because it teaches them how to pursue truth and the reasons why they should love pursuing truth, which is always going to follow them. But it's also important for when we are outside an academic setting. I think one of the things that we see a lot in society today is that people aren't exactly don't have their minds sort of trained to pursue truth. We see debates in the public sphere where people sort of talk past each other. They don't have a shared fundamental set of facts that they can debate from. Everything is very disjointed. And so what a classical education would do if more people were, sort of brought up in that world is give these people a certain fundamental set of facts that they can then go forth and pursue truth. And then also hopefully also develop a sort of love for pursuing truth. I think those are some of the more important reasons why we should care about character training.
Friends, I'm speaking today with Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about classical education as an attractive school choice for parents. Brandon, I imagine there may be some people who would object and raise that that old question of, well, what are you going to do with that, or that's not practical, or what people really need to know how to do is to write code, to read manuals, and STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that's going to save us all. How do you answer the STEM objection and the practicality objection?
I think it's important to be honest about what a classical education is going to do. I mean, if your goal is just to have all your kids become MIT graduates, you may be better off focusing on STEM. But I think a classical education offers something a bit more insofar as it does have academically rigorous results in both the humanities and STEM, but it also it cultivates the whole student. It's a pedagogy that's very centered around making a student a better person and a better scholar. And in doing so, there's no limit to what they could pursue. If they want to pursue the humanities, they're more than welcome to. If they want to pursue STEM, they're also more welcome to. So I definitely think there's room for what people can do after they receive the classical education. They're not all going to become classics majors. I don't think that's particularly useful for a society if everybody did the same exact thing, but I don't think that that's what a classical education is geared towards doing.
Right. It would seem to me that we have to teach people how to be lifelong learners and how to have a lifelong love for learning. And in my previous life, before I was in religious life, I worked in a lot of fields, some of them high tech. And I was certainly not a math major, certainly not a computer major of any kind, although I could write a few lines in BASIC, and I thought I was a god, and my first work computer had a 10-megabyte hard drive, and I thought I was ready to fly to the moon at that point. But I think that learning how to learn is an essential element, but that cultivating that lifelong love of learning, that I think is key. How is that done?
I think it's done by I think it's really done by just teaching children how to do it and demonstrating for them that it can be done. I think one thing that I've seen in the research that I've done for what I recently wrote for the Manhattan Institute is that from a very young age, students are brought up to really value reading the past, like the canonical texts that we have in Western civilization in the United States, more specifically. And I think what, in doing so, allows them to have a basic fundamental set of facts that they can then go on and be more self-expressive on more forward once they have mastered the very basics. Not only when it comes to reading like literature, reading history, but also when it comes to pursuing something like music. You know, a lot of classical education schools really value teaching kids the fundamentals of, you know, classical instruments, classical music. And then once those basic fundamentals are set, students have with them the fundamentals to go out and pursue their own ways of self-expression. And so that's, I think when you think about it that way, that's when students can really become lovers of learning and lovers of pursuing more skills and knowledge.
I also think, too, that having faculty that show joy in continual learning is absolutely essential. Friends, when we come back, I'm going to continue my conversation with Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about classical education for today. In the next segment, we're going to talk about 3 magic words: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audios podcast. Keep the conversation going. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
There's no better way to start your day than with spiritual formation from inspiring priests.
We have to remember, as we look back through history, life was very difficult for people, and therefore faith was fairly easy. In our society, life has become very easy, and therefore the faith has become very difficult. Life has become so simple and easy, so God's going to test our faith.
That's Sermons for Everyday Living, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern on the Station of the Cross.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert McCoy from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McCoy of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to City Journal. We're talking about classical education as a real academic choice for parents and students these days. Brandon, since the 1920s and the advent of John Dewey's emphasis of progressive education in America, education has been in flux. It's about adaptability. It's about emphasis on experience. It's student-centered learning. It's almost as if the school is a place for the child to discover himself, rather than develop intrinsically human tools for learning so that he can begin by receiving the very great heritage of Western civilization. There was a time where the absolute non-negotiable building blocks were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Most people think they know what those words mean. I'm willing to bet that they don't. Why do these 3 words have such a special place in classical education?
So grammar, logic, and rhetoric has its roots back all the way in the ancient Greek times, going up to the medieval period, and up into the modern day. It's been reintroduced into the classical education movement that we know today, most notably by Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, basically arguing that there are 3 specific arts in the classical and liberal arts that are really important towards developing the mind towards learning, and those are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar, as we know it today, is basically the very building blocks of learning, understanding the set core of facts, whether it be in literature, whether it be in language, whether it be in history or math or what have you, that really guide us towards further learning and further development. Logic is the sort of analytical understanding the whys and the hows of the world, letting students get a bit below the surface, understanding, how things develop, why things are, and that's obviously important because it's important when you're educating a student to make sure they know more than just the basic set of facts. And the rhetoric is more so important because it's the final stage in primary education development that allows students to become more expressive, allow them to take their own analytical approaches in understanding the world. But in doing so, from having the basics of the grammar and the logic stages, allows them to be developed in a certain manner so that they are analyzing facts and understanding the world in a very structured manner so that they don't get off the beaten path.
And I think that the structure really recognizes the stages of human development. I mean, you wouldn't expect of young children very refined judgment based on long experience. They just haven't been around that long. But they are sponges. And so to have them commit to memory things like poetry, great texts, facts, and dates, and also the really fundamental facts of life, so that they can go from this is true to why it's true. I mean, Aristotle called that knowledge of the fact versus knowledge of the reasoned fact. So I know that when I flick the switch, the light comes on, knowledge of the fact. Eventually, I want to get into knowledge of the reasoned fact, why the light comes on when I flick the switch. So that grammar becomes fundamental. And then if I understand it correctly, logic is getting into the why, and also getting into proofs. In other words, something is true not because I feel it, not because I really want to believe it, but it's true, I know it's true, and I can prove that it's true. But that seems to be very different from the rallying cry nowadays is, I have to tell my truth. How does a classical educator respond to that movement to have each child celebrate his absolute uniqueness and discover his own truth as the greatest good? How would that conversation play out?
Right, and I think it's one of the more fundamental disputes that traditional liberal arts classical education has had with more modern forms of education is a lot of people believe that classical education as it's constructed is far too restrictive, far too authoritative in a way that doesn't allow for self-expression. But it's important to understand that not only when we're talking about learning inside the classroom, but learning outside in the real world, that for everybody to have their own certain set of facts that only correspond to what they personally believe, it isn't really conducive towards building a society or towards pursuing any sort of truth beyond what you already claim to know. But a classical education would say is not that classical educators are against self-expression, is that they're for self-expression in a way that's trained towards pursuing the truth and navigating the world around that certain truth. And, I think that that's important to push back on because, I think what modern educators are trying to say should be pushed back on a lot more by classical educators because it is important to remember that these universal truths are true. And I think that as long as classical educators make that certain in the world, then there's no stopping there's no limit to where they could grow.
Brandon, I've been a priest for almost 25 years, and preaching is very, very important to me. And when I was teaching rhetoric, I used a book by T. David Gordon called Why Johnny Can't Preach. And the summary of the book is this: Johnny can't preach because Johnny doesn't read. Johnny can't preach because Johnny doesn't write. Johnny doesn't write because Johnny doesn't read. Johnny can't preach because Johnny can't think. Johnny can't think because he hasn't studied logic and Latin. And Johnny can't preach because Johnny can't speak. And he can't speak because he was never required to recite poetry from memory. as a child. Given your commitment to classical education, what do you make of that analysis that I've just summarized?
Oh, I think it's 100% spot on. I think that the best way for anybody, not just children, to learn is to learn how something can be mastered. I think that speaking is, for an example, as you raised, it requires the recitation of prior great speeches or prior great poetry. I think learning the fundamentals of building great speech requires understanding of language, and that's something that Latin can help with. And more specifically, when it comes to critical thinking, I think when you think about how people interpret math or how people learn math, I think that those things create an analytical mind that is conducive towards being a great thinker. And so that's why I think that the rhetoric stage requires the grammar and the logic stages, so that you have the specific fundamentals towards being able to express yourself in a fruitful way.
Friends, I'm speaking with Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute, and he's a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about grammar, logic, and rhetoric in service of a classical education, something that should be a real option for parents and their children. Brandon, there are words I want to rescue from the dustbin of history, and one is rhetoric, and especially during election years, some news commentator will say, "That's just rhetoric." And I would tell my students, anyone who says that is really shouting, "Look at me, I've never read Aristotle." Rhetoric isn't really manipulation. It's not a dishonest use of words. It's not shouting. What's the classical understanding of rhetoric?
Oh, rhetoric is persuasion. It's the assertion of facts. It's understanding how to convey facts to the world. So it's not rhetoric in the same sense that it's trying to convince people of things that are false. Is actually trying to convince people of things that are true. And I think that when you educate people in a classical manner, not only do you give them a certain fundamental set universal truth, you should also teach them in the rhetoric stage how to express them in a way that convinces people of them. And I think that probably one of the greater obstacles towards getting more people involved in a classical education is that there needs to be a greater effort in having better rhetoric towards telling people why a classical education is good.
Right. I mean, Aristotle makes useful distinctions in demonstration or proof. For example, I don't persuade you that the Pythagorean theorem is true. I can offer a demonstration of that. And dialectic is not so much a search for proof as it is to look for strengths and weaknesses in an argument. And then rhetoric is the art and science, Aristotle said, of finding the effective argument in each case. Rhetoric is about moving people towards action. We should do this. We shouldn't do that. We should praise this person. We should blame that person. And so the fundamentals is first of all, logos, the commitment to the truth. There is ethos, the credibility, the reputation of the character. I mean, I could write an anti-abortion speech that would be absolutely true, and if Hillary Clinton read it out loud, no one would believe it. And then there's pathos. There's the emotion. As Adlai Stevenson said, you don't want people to say, "Oh, that was a nice speech." You want people to jump up and say, "Oh my goodness, we've got to do something." And those are wonderful skills for young people to have entering into the world. Can you give us some examples of how rhetoric is taught and practiced in a classical education for older children?
Sure. So one of the more enduring methods that have been present in classical education is Socratic method, the Socratic dialogue, Socratic debate, whatever terminology you want to use. And what it basically allows students to do is to focus on a specific issue or focus on a general set of issues in a classroom setting, and have students generate their own ideas and have them compete in a public square in a classroom setting. And so what it trains them to do is not only to advance their own arguments, but also to advance them well and to speak them well. And the reason why the Socratic method is so useful is because it's designed towards the pursuit of truth. You may not walk away from an hour-long dialogue having everybody agree on the same end goal on a specific issue area. But you should walk away with a better understanding of competing narratives and competing facts, and trying to understand what it is that we all are trying to do and what may be the best way of doing so.
Right. There has to be a way of engaging people and to say we may have different starting points, but as long as we're equally committed to the truth, then we're really not opponents. We might be disputants, but we're allies in the search of truth. And once we reduce discourse to, I have to yell my truth over your truth, then eventually we have the rule by the loudest, which is eventually the rule of the strongest, and then welcome to the jungle. And that doesn't serve anyone well. Friends, we come back and continue my conversation with Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and contributor to City Journal. We're talking about classical education as a real option for parents and their children. In the next segment, we're going to focus in on classics and character. How are they related? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Grab the audio, write a 5-star review, follow the channel. We need to attract the attention of the algorithms so that these conversations get the attention they deserve. Take this to your family and friends, and together we'll take it around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McCaig of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to City Journal. We're talking about classical education as a real option for parents and their children. Brandon, when I was teaching full-time, I would give the students this conundrum. I said, would you like to be treated by a doctor who doesn't know chemistry, biology, or anatomy, but is a really nice guy, or someone who's very highly skilled, who can wield a scalpel with the best of them, but is amoral? And they'd figure out, no, we need competence and we need character. And there was a time when we understood that character was related to virtue, which goes back to the Greek word arete, which means excellence, and that now dirty word aristocracy originally meant rule by excellence. What's the link between commitment to excellence and commitment to development of character in a classical education?
Well, one of the things that we've seen both in the early modern period and in the ancient and medieval periods is that extended periods of education was for people in elite society, people who were going to become statesmen and theologians and whatnot. And the reason why character was so important is because you need good character to be a great leader. Now it seems as if character has sort of been delinked from education. And so there's still plenty of bright and very competent people in certain industries and in politics and in the public and private spheres. But you don't always see character being stressed as much as you would want to. And I think that the reason why a classical education is important is because it understands both the need for academic rigor and intellectual pursuits, but also understands that without character, you won't make a moral man. And so that's the link.
Right. You see, and I think one of the essentials for the development of good character is moral imagination. Aristotle said that the virtuous man shows us what's possible in human behavior. So, for example, once you see a man being honest or brave, you can't deny that it's possible to be honest, or brave. And one of my guests, Theodore Dalrymple, who was a medical doctor in the prison system in Britain, was dealing with young people, 18, 19 years old, who could barely, write their own name, certainly didn't read, didn't study history or literature. So, for example, every grievance they ever suffered was considered the greatest grievance and outrage of all time. So if, of course I had to kill him, he stepped on my foot, but anyone who has any sense of history, any sense of empathy, would realize that is nonsense. So I think part of the appeal of a classical education is going to be really the expansion of the human soul, to learn to look at things from other people's points of view, and that the way that you begin to do that is first in literature and then in history. Is there a rough plan or sequence across the curriculum in terms of age to help add to character development?
This is going to vary a lot between school to school, but in general, what is pretty common is the understanding that character is necessary. Now, classical schools come in a variety of different forms, from charter to homeschool to private schools to micro schools. They come in religious and secular forms. And obviously in a charter school, because it's a public school, it's not going to be able to teach like a Christian ethos. It's going to run afoul of federal laws regarding the separation of church and state. But a lot of private schools have either like a Protestant Christian or a Catholic Christian ethos that guides the learning that the students experience. And let's take the example of the charter schools, because that's what the report I wrote for the Manhattan Institute focused on. A lot of these schools have very rigorous civics courses that teach people the reasons why they should become effective citizens in the world or of the United States. They have certain methods of training people towards having good conduct. And when you see private schools, a lot of the times, obviously, religious courses are going to do a lot of that work.
Right. Brandon, I was having a conversation recently with a classically trained friend, and she made a very interesting observation. She said there was a time when a classical educated person was taught about the virtue of magnanimity, the orientation of the soul towards greatness, and a readiness to strive to achieve that greatness. She went on to say that what's being taught in schools now is, what kind of victim are you? And let's talk about the very many ways you have been oppressed. And now let's foment resentment. And then let's lead you to demand some compensation, some batch of free stuff because you've been oppressed from every different direction. Is that a fair summary of classical versus what's becoming more typical in public schools, or is that a caricature on your view?
I definitely see a distinction between public and more classical-oriented schools. I would say that a lot of public schools, particularly more progressive areas, see it as their mission to make students activists. I don't mean to use any negative connotations towards that word. You can be an activist for good or for bad. But obviously the orientation for a lot of them is to disrupt the system, critically challenge the system, even at a very young age where they may not be finished with their education. Whereas in a classical system, there's more of an orientation towards understanding a sort of universal justice, being able to help people within your community through your own individual works, not necessarily needing to critique the system more broadly, but recognizing that there are systemic ills as well, but understanding that as an individual person, I'm empowered to be able to do whatever I can and whatever I'm able to do to better myself and others. So there is a big distinction in that way.
Yeah. Friends, I'm speaking with Brandon McCoy, Project Manager for Education Policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to City Journal. We're talking about classical education and the formation of character. Brandon, one of the things that concerns me is that at least what I'm hearing and some of the things that I'm reading in the typical public school system is that sense of noble aspiration and a sense that we can aspire to be worthy heirs of a great Western heritage. And yet nowadays it seems to me the West seems to be a dirty word, and Western heritage seems to be an accusation rather than an occasion of praise. And we see young people chanting slogans and pulling down statues. How does someone who's a classical educator begin to sort out telling the whole truth of the bright spots and the not so bright spots of the West that doesn't lead people to pulling down statues?
Well, I think it's quite easy for a classical educator to do so by teaching the whole history, but teaching it in a way that grounds people in certain universal truths and enduring traditions about the West. I think that in order to be a good classical educator, you have to have the affirmative belief that Western traditions have produced some of the greatest and most enduring methods of operating in society. I think those are things that need to continue to be stressed. But it's also important for educators in the pursuit of truth to recognize where people within Western society have failed. So it's definitely true to the credit of many of the more critical and progressive educators out there that the West has had its own set of failures, the United States has had its own set of failures, and that those need to be addressed. But there's a way of doing so without demanding that the entire system come down, because it's not, one, it's not necessary, but two, it's also not good. We're all connected in a certain way to the enduring traditions of Western society, and as people who pursue truth, we're all connected to the enduring traditions within the Western canon, and those ideas definitely need to be continue to be assessed and studied.
Can we talk a little bit about the adaptability of a classical curriculum? I think back some years ago, a friend of mine, he had two little girls born to him in rapid succession, and a friend who worked for the CIA said, "Let me tell you something. The best thing you can have your girls do as they grow up is learn Mandarin." Is there a way for classical curriculum to be adaptable enough that someone wants to learn Chinese or learn how to write code, there's a place for that?
You mean within a school to learn Mandarin?
Within a school, yeah.
Yes, of course. Classical, I think a lot of different classical schools focus on different things, but particularly in the charter school realm, you're going to still find that they do adopt some of the programs from the traditional public schools because they are in and of themselves public schools. But also for homeschooling, there's a whole ton of options to operate within the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric with regards to learning a modern foreign language like Mandarin or learning how to code. The same principles would apply. You need to learn the basic foundations of anything like you would in the grammar stage, and then as you develop those skills more and master them more, you're able to go about and pursue more difficult tasks. So like take coding for an example. Once you've learned the basic foundations of code, you can go and code web design, or you can code game design or something like that. And those are things that a classical education still is adept enough to put inside of its own curriculum.
Brandon, have there been studies, ideally longitudinal studies, to suggest that classical education tends to produce a better outcome for students in terms of later achievement?
I haven't seen any that would suggest that classical education as a whole would produce better outcomes, mainly because classical education is a very broad brush. There are studies that suggest that learning Latin in grade school is something that will produce higher SAT scores, better college or higher rates of college enrollment. Obviously, if you learn more, you're going to do better. And I think that the way that a classical education allows students to go really deep into certain topics allows them to develop an analytical mind that will help them not only in terms of college enrollment and college graduation, but also in terms of job attainment as well.
Well, I know that when I was teaching full time, I only gave take home exams, and typically you'd have 2 weeks to write a 3 to 5 page essay or a 5 to 7 page essay, and within a paragraph, I can tell you whether or not the student had a serious habit of reading, because the quality of your writing is directly correlated to the quality of your reading. And if you're not reading anything serious, you can scarcely be capable of writing anything. And when I started studying Latin, I didn't realize what a loose language English could be. It's more like watercolors, whereas Latin prizes accuracy, precision, very, very refined distinction, and it became a very useful discipline for me. And I only wish that I had studied more Latin when I was coming up, and my young brain would have been more adaptable to absorbing more of the language. Now that I'm older, it's going to be an uphill slog. But fortunately, there are apps for such things these days. And if you want to pick up Latin in a relative hurry, look for an app called Duolingo. Friends, when we come back, I'm going to continue my conversation with Brandon McCoy. He's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about classical education as a real option for parents and their children. In the next segment, we're going to be talking about generating advice for parents, how to go forward. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Follow the conversation, follow what we're following, talk with us by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Take it to your family and friends, and together we'll take it around the world. We really can do it together, and we certainly cannot do it without you. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
The Station of the Cross thanks our financial supporters who have enabled us to broadcast Catholic programs for more than 20 years. As a nonprofit lay organization not affiliated with your diocese, our apostolate is listener-supported. Through your generosity, we're able to inspire countless listeners with the gospel message and help lead them to a parish to be spiritually nourished by the sacraments. Thank you for your continued support, and may God bless you and your family.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McCaig of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Brandon McCoy, Project Manager for Education Policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about classical education as a real option for parents and their children. You know, Brandon, for a lot of folks, the school year is about to start. Decisions have already been made. Supposing someone has their kids in a non-classical setting and said, hey, Father McTague and Brandon McCoy, they really made the sale regarding the merits of classical education. I want to supplement my kids' education with classical resources. Where do they turn to first?
I think the first thing is identifying how exactly they want their child to be educated. If they're pursuing homeschooling methods, there's tons of resources for someone who may be interested in homeschooling their kids in a classical manner. I believe I mentioned this before, but a book called The Well-Trained Mind has been in circulation for several years, but is basically dedicated to giving parents a ton of resources regarding homeschooling children in a classical manner. Obviously, every parent should check with their state laws regarding homeschooling because some make it a lot more difficult than others, but that is certainly an option for many parents. When it comes to a private or a charter school, definitely check within directories or searches online. Those will be the quickest sources at your fingertips. And there's tons of different options where people focus really on the humanities, where there's a lot more of a broader aspect, where there's secular, there's religious, Catholic, Protestant. There's tons of resources for people out there to get their children into a classical education.
And we're linking to a website called welltrainedmind.com that is just chock-a-block full of resources. I've been skimming through it, and I've made a list of articles and videos that I would like to read as well. A fundamental insight of Catholic thought is that really the primary educators of children are parents, and that really any other form of education is meant to be a supplement, and that it's not enough to just drop your kid off at school the way you would say drop your kid off to the dentist. You say, look, I'm not a dentist. I'm not going to clean my kid's teeth. They're going to do that. Why is it not enough for parents to simply leave education to the professionals?
Oh, I mean, there's just so many things that a child will miss out if the only interactions with education is with the professionals from the ages of 5 to 18. I mean, studies show that the best way to make sure your kids have a great head start when they get into school is to read to them at a very early age, and continue learning with them as they go through K through 12 education as well. But focusing more on the character aspects, the people who are who are in the best position to help children become not only better learners but better people are the parents. They're the first examples they get of what it means to be a good man or a good woman, a good mother, a good father, and they're the people who are going to be closest with them when it comes to developing those characters and qualities towards learning. So parents definitely should take the initiative in making sure their kids get a great education, not only within the schoolhouse, but also in the regular house as well.
Friends, I'm speaking with Brandon McCoy, he's project manager for education policy at the Manhattan Institute and a contributor to the City Journal. We're talking about advice for parents who are considering a classical education for their children. Brandon, I remember, it was last year sometime, there was a story, there's some school district in Australia that was discouraging parents from reading to their young children because it was found that parents who read to their children from a very early age help their children be prepared for school, develop good habits, and really excel in school. And some educators decided it wasn't fair that some children excelled while others did not. And so for the sake of equity, parents should be discouraged from reading to their children, and that way that there'd be a really level playing field because of fairness. What's going on in the mind of educators that sort of crazy suggestion could come out of their mouths?
Well, I think what we see in our society is that there are ways in which people have unequal resources and means. I mean, I think anyone, regardless of whether they're progressive or conservative, would be foolish to not note that the amount of wealth or income they may have an impact on how well their child does in life, or what positions they are in society. But the impulse to suggest that parents should have a completely hands-off approach in order to give fairness, I think is misguided, because practically everybody should. I think everybody should have parents who are willing to be involved, and I think that is so important to maintaining and producing a good society that, the idea that parents don't read to their kids for the sake of fairness is not only unfair to those children, but it's also unfair to society at large.
Right. I agree. I think that everyone benefits when we encourage a culture of excellence. Everyone benefits when we decide to cultivate character in a very positive way. And it boggles me that somehow misunderstandings of equity and fairness cast those very obvious truths into doubt. Have you seen some data? Is the classical movement growing, or are we just talking about an obscure fringe group here?
Well, I haven't seen any data that can track, the number of people who are involved in a classical education. Because so many people who are educated classically are educated homeschool, it's hard to get a real sense of how many people are engaged in classical learning. Mm-hmm. But if you talk to anybody in these circles, whether they're private schools or charter schools, or they have these homeschooling networks, they're all saying that, particularly within the last year, that there's been a huge increase in the people who have been interested in classical learning. And there's been an increase more broadly over the past couple of decades as people become more frustrated with their traditional public schools for one reason or another. Classical learning has seemed to continue to grow. So it's definitely a growing field. It's an emerging field. And I think that hopefully in the next few years, we're going to see it grow even more and reach communities it hasn't reached yet. And so I'm pretty optimistic about its growth right now.
What has the effect of the COVID interruption been on perceptions of homeschooling and classic education?
I think it's, some people, they get into homeschooling or classical education because maybe they just wanted in-person instruction and their public school districts just weren't allowing for it. Or maybe they weren't allowing for it in a way that they thought was conducive to their child's learning. And classical education is a byproduct of that. It's not really something that's primary in their mind. But a lot of people, for ideological, religious, or conceptual reasons, have become attracted to classical education specifically, not just homeschooling more broadly. And I think that's a promising fact for a lot of people in the classical education space, because it means that their ideas are becoming more mainstream, are becoming more accepted in society. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why I believe that the growth that we're seeing right now isn't going to just be a temporary sign of COVID, but hopefully will grow after COVID as well.
Brandon McCoy of the Manhattan Institute, thank you for being a very fine guest. I enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you very much.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McCaig, your host every day here at the Catholic Current. Join me tomorrow. I'm going to meet Heather McDonald, a New York Times bestselling author. She's Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. We're going to be talking about a question she addressed recently in print: is classical music under attack? I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to keep the conversation going among your friends, we make available to you. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may Mary God bless you. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.